Will it then cause catastrophic climate change to the Earth? It's very difficult to figure that out by looking at climate simulations, computer simulations done of climate, because they are so complex. But you can ask what has been happening to climate as carbon dioxide has been building up in the air, and then give an expectation for the future. The 20th century shows a pattern of warming early in the century that can't be related to the increase of greenhouse gases in the air. So up until about 1940, it's warming, unrelated to carbon dioxide. Then there's a cooling or a flattening of the temperature. That can't be, you can't be getting a cooling from increasing carbon dioxide. And then there's the warming at the end of the 20th century.
Professor John Christie of the University of Alabama, Huntsville. He doesn't think that CO2 has the disastrous effect on the climate predicted by the computer models. He says something is going on in the atmosphere that we do not yet understand.
The natural world has a great capacity to relinquish the heat that carbon dioxide wants to trap, but is unable to because of so many processes in the natural world that allow the heat to escape. And so the world has many ways in which it tries to keep a balance and has many avenues to do that with. And one of them is to let the heat escape more rapidly to space and not build up in the atmosphere.
John Christie says the increased quantities of CO2 in the atmosphere may not intensify the greenhouse effect because, with the help of satellites, he has made an important discovery. He and a colleague have examined the increases in temperature on the Earth's surface over the last 25 years and compared them to satellite measurements of the temperature on the lowest part of the atmosphere, the troposphere.
In 1988, when a dramatic statement was made about global warming based upon surface thermometers, my colleague Roy Spencer and I thought there had to be a better way because the surface thermometer network was not really global and had a lot of problems. So we used weather satellites. Well, we brought together the results of 7 or 8 different satellites that were launched at different times and strung together a complete time series of what the Earth was doing. No one had done that to that point. Once all of these satellites were strung together, we could then look at the temperature change over time. And the strange thing we found was that there's very little change in the global temperature. And this was a surprise to us because the surface temperature showed an increase, but this bulk of the atmosphere, the real climate system, was not. And that then caused us to realize that the human effects of climate are likely not happening the way we think they are. And that then allows us to question what climate models are telling us about the world.
There is much new evidence showing the sun has cycles over centuries. The Earth has warmings and coolings that follow in step with the sun. The sun's changes is one reason why the Earth has climate change.
In our research, we are showing the excellent correlation between the regular fluctuations in the brightness of the sun and earthly temperatures, and hundreds of other studies have shown similar trends.
Let's continue, because your film answers the question, or tries to answer the question, why is it getting hotter, with the theory that it's in fact the sun that causes global warming.
In 1991, senior scientists at the Danish Meteorological Institute decided to compile a record of sunspots in the 20th century and compare it with the temperature record. What they found was an incredibly close correlation between what the sun was doing and changes in temperature on Earth. Solar activity, they found, rose sharply to 1940, fell back for almost 4 decades, and then started to rise again.
Well, once again, we asked our climatologists to have a look at this section of the film and to comment on it.
They stopped the record because they don't mention it falls when the temperature continues, so it's classic. Pick the section of the record that fits your preconception and then leave out the inconvenient parts.
The graph conveniently stops at 1980, when the temperature starts to rise much more rapidly and the solar activity decreases, the opposite of what they claim.
Why didn't you just continue that graph on to the present day Because there are graphs available which do that.
Well, firstly, the graph that we were using was created by Professor Friis Christensen from the Danish Space Agency. So
in what year?
completely... I can't remember off the top of my head.
25 years ago.
Yeah, and it was in a period where a part of the programme where we're talking about, it was a historical part of the programme where we're talking about key discoveries in the history of, recent history of climatology.
Shall I tell you what happens after 1980? The temperature continues to rise very sharply. Solar activity falls off in the other direction. Now, that would have been very hard to explain in your film, wouldn't it, if you'd actually used the modern data?
Well, I mean, the graph that we used from Friis Christensen was the graph that he published in a very famous paper that sort of came out and was in part of the programme that we were talking about the history of people's understanding of what the solar effects might have been on the temperature of the 20th century.
The section, as you say, is based on his work, but when he and his colleagues saw your graphs and the way in which you'd use them in the programme, they felt compelled to correct you. They wrote this, that their latest studies had explicitly concluded that after 1985, temperature continued to rise, just as I said, while the sunspot cycle length flattened out and thus no longer correlated with surface temperature. And they went on to say this point was not included in the narrator's statement. How many versions of the swindle have you actually put out since the complaints started to come through?
Oh, I mean, I do have to ask Channel 4 that. I don't know. I mean, we've got an international version.
I've counted at least 4 which have slight or major differences in them.
Oh, no, we immediately made the changes that we could straight away before we could get other graphs done. And then for subsequent ones, we've had graphs redone and to correct the errors that were pointed out. But I mean, the thing is, the basic argument isn't changed by
why were there so many errors in the beginning? This is the strange thing.
Oh, because, it took us 6 weeks to get this thing edited. I had 3 edit suites going at the same time, and the graphics arrived a day before the programme went out. And so, you know what the nature of television is. We put the programme out. We hope that it's right.
Well, with 4 different versions, you could make the case that the documentary itself is as changeable as the weather.
Ah, what a neat line. The thing that makes me slightly sad is that, there is this aggressiveness to anyone who comes up and says, look, the science doesn't necessarily stack up. Look at the evidence here.
The ozone is not at all what people think it is today. The ozone is much like a person's body, much like the earth, much like the water, the sea. Without the microorganisms in the earth or the creeping things that Yahweh put in the earth, you could not live. No life as we know it could live. In fact, it would die too. If the microorganisms in the earth or the creeping things suddenly all died, everything would die. Everything would die. You couldn't live at all on the face of the earth, the life as we know it. Now, we have these in seawater, even more so in seawater than we have in the soil. That keeps the waters clean. They keep it adjusted. They keep the amount of ultraviolet rays adjusted to where only a portion of it, just the right portions of it, will get to the sea life that the fish that we live on, that we use for food. All animals, all of man's food must be supplied. They must have the creeping things that Yahweh created in order to survive. What we have done, it's made to take care of itself. Sure it is. Smoke, the burning of wood or coal, this doesn't bother the atmosphere. This doesn't bother the firmament. It doesn't bother the kingdoms. Ashes falling on the earth doesn't bother or destroy the things with which the earth creeps. Smoke does not destroy the things with which our firmament creeps, which is part of the earth. It's part of a protective shield of the earth that Yahweh created. During that 7 days of creation, Yahweh created it, otherwise there would not be any life. You couldn't have it. You could burn coal and smoke. This has nothing to do with the firmament. And you will find this out if you will start paying attention to what Yahweh shows you here. If you will test the firmament, you will find it's full of microorganisms, as you call it, creeping things with which the earth creeps, the heavens creep too.